Well, it's great to be back. I just got back from Africa with my wife. We were traveling on behalf of Compassion International, and you're probably seeing on the screen right now a picture of me with someone who's not dressed similarly to the way you and I would dress. That is actually the pastor I met of the Maasai church right outside of Kenya, and this trip was incredibly meaningful, and we were invited to come by Compassion International. The highlight for me, though, was being able to go on this experience with my wife. Normally, I'll be invited to these missions experiences to go check out missions bases, and I'll go with other pastors, but the whole time I'm gone, I miss my family terribly bad. So the opportunity to experience everything with Di was, it was a really big deal. And it was really inspiring to see all of the Compassion International projects that were taking place in that entire region. And I would sum it up by saying it was really awesome. It was an amazing experience, and I have lots of memories that I will share with you probably more and more over the weeks and months to come. But specifically when we were in Africa, I was studying for this particular message. And as I studied this message, you know that we are in the middle of a series called The Pursuit of Happiness. And you might remember the very first message in this where I talked about blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. I used an illustration from Stanford University, where I talked about how this group of really smart people took all of this time and all of these resources to determine if people can really achieve happiness. And what they found out was that when people set out to have happiness be their life goal, life aspiration, they never find it. But instead, when people set out to find a life of meaning and a life of purpose, they always find it, but as a caveat, in addition, they are also happy. And the point that I used in that first message was that happiness is not something that can be achieved. It is something that is received. And Jesus, on the Sermon on the Mount, this most famous sermon that has ever been preached, started it off by sharing the Beatitudes. And the Beatitudes really unlock the key to having a blessed life. And that word blessed that you see over and over again used is simply translated as happy. But the more accurate translation would be a deep, full, meaningful life. And it's not something that you can achieve. It's something that you receive. And as I was in Africa, thinking specifically about the Beatitude that I was teach from today, one particular story comes to my mind. And I want to share it with you in just a moment. But first, let's read the text that I'm going to teach from today. It's verse 6. And it said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they'll be filled." We are reading through the Bible together as a church, and I'm reading through the Bible this year in the Message translation. I love the way the Message sums up this verse. And it says this, it says, "You're blessed when you've worked up a good appetite for God. He's food and drink and the best meal that you'll ever eat." I want to ask everybody to bow your heads, close your eyes. I want you to repeat this prayer after me. Everyone say, "Dear Jesus, speak to my heart, change my life. In Jesus' name, amen." So I was reminded about this verse when we were visiting a Compassion International project in the middle of the slums outside of Nairobi. Nairobi has two major slums. We actually went to the smaller of the two. The larger of the two slums is the second largest slum in the world. In fact, it's so dangerous to visit that slum that when outsiders or missionaries come, they're only allowed in the slum by armed escort. So Compassion didn't take us to that slum because there was some unrest that was happening there. They had planned on taking us there, but they took us to another slum. And we came upon, after driving through this slum, this huge church, and we met all the women that were involved in the Compassion International Project. They shared stories of different ways that that particular ministry and the investment from people in the U.S. has meant to them. And then after they were done, we actually did a home visit. And you're going to see some pictures in just a moment of that home visit. But we're talking today about hungering and thirsting. And when I went to this home visit, I saw people that were thirsty, and I saw people that were hungry. And I want to let you know that that type of hunger and thirst is not what Jesus is referring to here in this beatitude. But you'll see in this picture, my wife's arriving at the house. There's actually 3 separate families that live at this house. So we were in the far right-hand corner section, and you'll notice in these other pictures, that is the entire house, what you're seeing. That's where they sleep. That's where they eat. That's where they cook their food. The entire living area, as humbling as this is to admit, is smaller than my office at the church. And while we were there, this gal that you'll see in the middle of that picture, she was sharing that one of the most meaningful things that Compassion International has done for her is it taught her a trade, taught her how to make purses. And she started describing the process with which she makes those purses. You'll probably notice on that table in the middle of the room 2 purses. One of those purses takes her 2 days to make. The other purse takes her 1 day to make. Costs her about 800 shillings to make a purse. The shilling is about 100 shillings to $1. So it costs her about $8 to make a purse. I asked her, how many of these purses do you sell a week? And she said, for me to be able to feed my family, I have to sell at least 1 purse a week. She said, I usually sell 1 purse a week. And so, of course, some of the women asked, how much you sell those purses for? And she said, we sell them for 1,500 shillings at the market. So 1,500 shillings is, again, about $15. So if you do some quick mathematics there, you can find out that she makes about $7 US a week. And that $7 US a week that she makes is enough resources for her to provide food for her family. Here's what I found fascinating being there. You know, I met her kids and we met her husband and we saw her. And these are people that from American standards, we would say, she's hungry. Their family, they're thirsty. But I will be honest, they're only hungry for food and they're only thirsty for something to drink because the rest of their life is totally full. It was the most satisfied, full of love family that I had come in contact with in a long time. With this beatitude, Jesus is really trying to help explain to you and I the difference. He says, if you want to be full, if you want to be satisfied, if you want to have a rich, full, meaningful life, if you want to be happy, if you want to be contented, he said you need to hunger and thirst for righteousness. He said, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. I want to share with you today what I believe are the 3 keys to unlocking that verse. And you might notice that right in front of me is the purse that gal made. So my wife, after we left, was adamant that she had to buy the purse. So this cost us 1,500 shillings or $15 US. And when we bought this purse, we knew that we were filling the hunger and filling the thirst that this woman had and her family for a week. Here's the purse. So today I want to share with you what I think are the 3 keys to unlock this particular verse. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they'll be filled. And the first key is this, and understand my heart when I share this, but I believe deep down that every single person is created empty. That it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter your socioeconomic standard. You might be living in a little tiny house in a slum in Nairobi, or you might be living in a huge house that overlooks the water in Mukilteo. But you are the same, that you are created with this vacuum inside of you. It's one of those innate beliefs that I have as a minister. It keeps me going. You see, I've been in ministry since I was 19, and for the last 25 years, wherever I preached, wherever I shared the gospel, I believed that in that room were people that were empty. That you and I have this deep emptiness. It's our soul is hungry. Our heart is thirsty, that we are longing for something, that you might be here today, and that is you right now. You are restless. That we are created with this grass always seems greener wherever we aren't. That word hunger, it's defined as to want, to crave, to feel an aching sense of emptiness, to long for. And I believe that every single person is created kind of with this hole inside of them, that they're empty. The prophet Isaiah said this. He said, "Why spend money on what is not bread?" He said, "In your labor on what does not satisfy." He said, "Listen to me and eat what is good, and you will delight in the richest of fare." The prophet Jeremiah said it this way. He said, "My people have committed 2 sins. They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water." You see, what these prophets are acknowledging is the fact that every person, we have a soul that is hungry. We have a heart that is thirsty, that we are longing for something, and we try, but everything seems to be just out of reach. When Jesus said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness," he knew that his audience got what he was saying, because people understood what it meant to be hungry. They understood what it meant to be thirsty, and they understood beyond just food and beyond just water what it meant to want to be satisfied with this life. So number 1, I think everyone's empty. And number 2, that every one of us tries all of these different things to fill this emptiness. I mean, most of us, we try to fill emptiness with pleasure. We convince ourselves one of the greatest lies of the enemy, that what we're missing in life, what we lack, is pleasure. That if I have pleasure, then I'll be happy. If I have pleasure, then I'll satisfy this longing. If I have pleasure, Pleasure will make me feel fulfilled. So that's why we spend our lives pursuing stuff. Man, we convinced ourselves, if I drive this car, live in this house, wear these clothes, have this stuff, I have this car, this motorcycle, this boat, this gun, whatever it is, then I'll be happy. And then when that doesn't work, we pursue relationships. And so people will jump from one relationship to another, hoping that will make them satisfied and fulfilled. And I have been married for 24 years almost now. And I've been in a relationship with my wife since we were 19. I met her my freshman year of college, and being able to go to Africa was extra meaningful because I got to experience it with my favorite person, my best friend, the person that I'm in love with. But even then, that relationship, and as much as I love Di and as great as our marriage is, that cannot fill the emptiness that's inside of me. So once relationships don't work, then people will try extreme excitement. Man, they will do crazy things thinking this will make me satisfied. This will bring me joy. This will make me happy. This will fill the emptiness that's inside of me. Other people, man, they'll try drugs. They'll self-medicate. They'll try all these different things. That's why there's such an outcry right now over this movie, 50 Shades of Grey. You might remember that when this book came out, I preached on this book about, 3 years ago. And why are so many people enthralled with a book that is so poorly written? Or a movie that on Rotten Tomatoes has 1-star rating? Why are people so infatuated with it? Because they're so dissatisfied with their own life that a moment to step out of their life and fantasize about maybe what could be, they think will make them happy. They think will fill them. Why are some of you still stewing in depression over the fact that Pete Carroll did not hand the ball off to Marshawn Lynch on the 1-yard line? Why? Because there's this thought that, man, if the Seahawks become a dynasty, man, I'm going to feel different. Man, I'm going to be happy. And then when Seahawks lose the Super Bowl because we put all of our hope in that, we end up empty. So what happens when we pursue pleasure and all of these other things to fill this emptiness? We become what these prophets are saying. We drink from broken cisterns, and we eat bread that does not satisfy, because we are trying to fill this insatiable hunger and thirst, this longing, this restlessness with things that ultimately, in the end, don't satisfy. And we wake up still empty. C.S. Lewis made this statement. It's a great quote. He said, "If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world." You see, the key to unlocking this verse is to realize that every single person's empty. I mean, it doesn't matter who you are. It's what gives me such confidence when I preach, regardless of who's in the crowd. Because I know you can be as rich as Paul Allen or as big of a philanthropist as Bill Gates, as great of an athlete as Michael Jordan. It doesn't matter who you are, we are all created equal. I mean, every single one of us has this emptiness inside of us, and we try to fill it in all these different ways. Bill Gates with philanthropy, Paul Allen starting businesses, making more money, athletic success, but in the end, those things don't do it. In the end, we're still empty. And that's what Jesus is trying to say. He said, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they'll be filled. So not only is everybody empty, not only do we try to fill it with all of these pleasures that in the end don't work, the only thing that can truly satisfy us is Jesus. I believe this about every single person that lives. That if someone does not have a relationship with Jesus, I don't care where they're at in their career. I don't care how much wealth they have. I don't care how much fame they have. If they do not have a relationship with Jesus, they are still empty. I mean, you think about all these different people. Hugh Hefner has everything that the world would say you need to aspire after as far as relationships. And the dude is empty. Donald Trump has about as much fame and wealth as a person can imagine, and the guy is still empty. Because the only thing that will truly satisfy us is knowing Jesus. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they'll be filled. You are blessed when you work up a good appetite for God. He's food and drink in the best meal you'll ever eat. What's challenging, though, with this particular verse is, what exactly is Jesus referring to as righteousness? Man, if righteousness is something that you and I need to hunger after, what is he referring to? And unlike the other Beatitudes, verse 6 is difficult to completely comprehend by itself. You actually need to read the rest of the chapter and actually most of the Sermon on the Mount, because it unlocks what Jesus was defining as righteousness. He says this in Matthew chapter 5, verse 20. He says, I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. Basically, what is Jesus saying? He's saying, hey, there's all these guys that have followed all of these rules and all these regulations, and they have lived for works. They have lived for the appearance of righteousness. And he says, that's all good, but unless your righteousness surpasses righteousness on the outside, if it's righteousness that is in your heart and in your mind, then, and only then, will you be hungering and thirsting after the type of righteousness that I'm talking about. And what he does is, in the rest of chapter 5, he gives 6 illustrations of what righteousness really is. And he doesn't specifically define righteousness for us, but he gives us all of these different examples, and we're supposed to take all of these examples and have this aha moment where we realize, it goes beyond our actions and it's our heart. And let's look at them. I mean, they're simple things. They're things that you and I wouldn't disagree with. So he's defining righteousness. He says this: if you want to know this righteousness that you're supposed to hunger and thirst after, verse 21, he said, you've heard it said to people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. Now, we all agree, you shouldn't kill people. And murder's wrong. Nobody's going to argue with that. But Jesus says this, he says, but I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Jesus is saying, you want to know the type of righteousness that I am challenging you with that surpasses that of the religious leaders and the Pharisees? He says, forget murder. I'm going to challenge you to not be angry. He goes on in verse 27, and he uses another one that we all agree with. He said, You've heard that it was said, don't commit adultery. I think every single one of us would say, I'd prefer my spouse not commit adultery. I mean, we've seen adultery destroy marriages, hurt kids. We agree, adultery, wrong. But Jesus says, but I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has committed adultery with her in his heart. Jesus says, you want to have the type of righteousness that I'm talking about. He says, forget adultery. He says, I want to challenge you to not even look at another woman lustfully. And all your wives said, amen. And Jesus goes on, verse 31. Man, he's really starting to hit it hard. He says, it has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. You see, in the Old Testament, there were all of these different reasons that you could divorce your wife. And when you did that, you were to give her a certificate of divorce. But Jesus says, but I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her a victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. He says, forget about what the Old Testament allows for divorce. Now, I am going to challenge you. You want to strive after the type of righteousness that I'm calling you to? You should keep your covenant commitments and avoid relationships with those who don't. One of the things that's interesting about church, and we know statistically that the divorce rate in the church is almost as high as it is outside of the church. And I know that there's many of you here today that have walked through a divorce and you've gone through the pain of what that is. And I understand that. And there is so much grace, and we want to work with people with that, want to love people through these situations, and we understand that. But what I don't have patience for is when I have people that will come up to me and say things like, I think I married the wrong person. When you were 19, you chose to marry this person, that person became the right person. And Jesus is saying you shouldn't be flippant with all of these commitments. You made a commitment, that is a covenant relationship. Stick with it. So Jesus goes on, verse 33, talks about commitments more. He said, again, you've heard that it was said to the people long ago, don't break an oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows that you've made. Basically, hey, be a man of your word. Be a woman of your word. If you made a commitment, follow through on it. You made a promise, fulfill that promise. But Jesus says, but I tell you, don't swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne. What is he saying? He's saying, I know that you've been told if you make a promise, you should fulfill it. But I am telling you that a righteous person doesn't need to make a promise or declare an oath so that someone will believe them. Have you ever noticed that when someone says, man, I promise you, when my kids come up to me and they say, Dad, I promise you I'm telling you the truth. If someone has to promise they're telling you the truth, it's usually because in the past they haven't. Jesus goes on and he says this, verse 38. He said, you've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Human nature, we hate injustice. We want justice. If someone has been wronged, the person that wrongs them needs to be taken care of. I don't think any one of us would disagree with that. I've joked for years that my mom hates injustice movies. My mom wants everything to be just and fair, and she's probably a lot like all of you. And Jesus says, you're right. In the past, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But he says, if you want to strive after the type of righteousness that I'm talking about, he says, I tell you, don't resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on your right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. So Jesus says, yeah, hey, You're right. Everybody wants fair retribution. Everybody wants justice. But I want to challenge you. Don't fight for justice. Don't fight that you be right. Don't fight for retribution for yourself. Instead, turn the other cheek. So that's the type of righteousness I'm talking about. And finally, Jesus says in verse 43, he said, you've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Have you ever noticed it's easy to love people we love? It's easy to love people we like. And it's easy to dislike people we dislike. Jesus says anyone can do that. He said, but if you want the type of righteousness that will have you be satisfied, he said, I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Jesus said anyone can love their neighbor. Anyone can do that. He said, but I want to challenge you. Love your enemy. That is what Jesus is challenging you and I to hunger and thirst after. A righteousness that, frankly, you hear all those things and you think, well, if that's the type of righteousness that I'm supposed to try to aspire for, I can't succeed because I cannot do this on my own. Man, when I look at Brandon, Brandon wants things to be fair. He wants things to be just. When people wrong me, I want to not like them. And Jesus says, I want you to strive after righteousness. And it is a righteousness that is not of this world. Hunger and thirst that can't be satisfied by anything in this world. It is this constant reminder from God that you and I weren't made for this world. We were made for God. That when we try to fill this emptiness with stuff, with relationships, with success and excitement, all these different things, we're missing the whole point because we were created to have a relationship with Jesus. That until we have a relationship with Jesus, until we know him personally, we're going to have this emptiness inside. You see, ultimately, when Jesus says hunger and thirst for righteousness, then you'll be filled, he is challenging us to have this deep desire to know God. That is the only thing in the end that will satisfy you. Jesus also said, seek first my kingdom and my righteousness, and all these things will be added to you as well. Make righteousness your passion, your pursuit. And in the end, you'll be blessed. You'll be satisfied. Because remember, blessing is not something that can be achieved. Blessing is something that is received. Finally, last thing I want to read and I'm done. Matthew chapter 7, verse 21. Jesus said, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of the Father that is in heaven. He said, many will say to me on that day, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and drive out demons in your name and perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. You see, what you and I want in our life is a deep relationship with Jesus where we know Jesus personally. And church, I don't know where you're at, but I want to tell you, if you do not have a personal relationship with Jesus, if you do not know him, if you are not hungering and thirsting after that type of knowledge, you will never fill the emptiness that's in here. I want to ask everybody to bow your heads and close your eyes.